Hello, my name is Urvashi Chakravarty, and I'm an Associate Professor of English at the University of Toronto. I'm delighted and very honoured that my book, Fictions of Consent, Slavery, Servitude and Free Service in Early Modern England, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2022, has been shortlisted for the Society for Renaissance Study Biennial Book Prize. Thank you very much. Fictions of Consent explores the ideologies of racialized slavery in 16th and 17th century England in a moment which preceded the development of an organized trade in enslaved persons. In light of the long-standing and persistent fiction that England was innocent of slavery, and that early modern England was in fact too pure an air for slaves to breathe in, I show instead that the ideologies of slavery were in fact ubiquitous. My book attends to the everyday sites such as the household, the family, the theatre, and the grammar school classroom, where the ideologies of racialized slavery were received and circulated, reading works by Shakespeare, Milton, and other early authors alongside lexicons, legal documents, letters, indentures, translations of classical comedies, and juvenilia in the Atlantic world. In the case of the humanist classroom, for instance, I examine the reception of Roman slavery to argue that early modern English schoolboys inherited and developed not only powerful ideas of race and slavery from these classical slave plays, but also specifically frameworks of immutable and heritable bondage. In particular, I argue that the figurative stain of slavery that was thought to attach to Roman freedmen even after manumission came to be understood as a somatic, permanent, and heritable marker of bondage in the context of the Atlantic world. Early modern England was, of course, also a service society, wherein everyone was a servant and where service was perfect freedom. Service then was not just incompatible with slavery, but indeed its antithesis. I argue, however, that the quotidian spaces of early modern English life and service anticipated and were in fact complicit in generating the larger conceptual architecture for Atlantic slavery. One of the ways in which Fictions of Consent situates the pervasive service economy of early modern England within the context of enslavement is by demonstrating how the widespread frameworks of volitional service that we see in early works provided the authorizing strategies for the fictions of happy slavery in the Atlantic world. For instance, I look at contracts of apprenticeship and indenture in the period to explore the contractual contingencies of consent to labour and service, and I demonstrate how the fictions of consent, as I call them, within these contracts anticipated and supplied the rhetorical, ideological, and legal frameworks of bound and coerced labour. Turning to the family and the household, meanwhile, I suggest that although the meaning of the family at this time included all the members of the household, including servants, it was also increasingly bound together by blood. In unpacking the family's ties to both service and consanguinity, I suggest that the early modern family consolidated a crucial nexus between the bloodlines of descent and the racialized heritability of bondage. Some of the key questions that animated Fictions of Consent included the following. How did an entire nation come to be so invested materially and culturally, both in an organized and brutal trade in enslaved peoples and in its utter disavowal? And what were the strategies by which this was achieved? At the same time, I was also fascinated by what seemed to be an abiding interest and traffic in stories of service, so much so that upstairs, downstairs stories are a notable cultural export. In writing this book, I sought to dispel the idea that the long histories of service and slavery somehow stand apart from each other. Rather, I wanted to show how the kinds of strategic narratives around service that we continue to absorb and enjoy even to this day provided the legitimating fictions for the longer and larger justifications for slavery. This book aims to hold early modern England and its narratives of exceptional and essential freedom to account for the frameworks of slavery that it paradoxically but strategically engendered, to resist the long history of British innocence and exceptionalism around racialized slavery, and to think instead about how early modern English texts were complicit in conceiving the strategies that would make it possible. Thank you.